Hey everyone, it's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and we're continuing on with our opening series today, talking about the Alekhine Defense. The Alekhine Defense is another king's pawn opening. White's going to begin the game with pawn to e4, putting that pawn in the center of the board, and black responds with the very provocative knight to f6, attacking this pawn right away before black stakes out any space for themselves in the center. And white's most popular move here by far is to respond with e5, kicking this knight away immediately. White does have a couple alternatives we can briefly discuss, but they're not considered very ambitious. For example, if white simply defends this pawn with something like knight to c3, then black would have a couple pleasant options here. First of all, black could play e5 and go right back to a symmetrical king's pawn opening, but they've avoided a lot of the main lines that white can usually play. This would be the Vienna game, which is certainly a very playable opening for white, but black has managed to avoid the Ruy Lopez, the Italian game, and a lot of those lines that are considered the most ambitious for white in these e4, e5 openings. Or alternatively, if black doesn't want to play that and they want to keep this game in kind of original territory, d5 is certainly a very reasonable move as well. After e4, knight f6, if white played something like d3, it's kind of the same story. Both e5 and d5 are pretty comfortable for black. So white usually plays e5 here, kicking this knight away, and this knight usually comes to d5, and now white can claim the whole center here with pawn to d4, and white has a big space advantage. Not only with these two pawns in the center, but even this pawn can come to c4 in some lines, and sometimes white will even put this pawn on f4, and we'll see that black can end up very cramped if they don't play properly. In this particular position, black almost always has to start fighting back against this white space advantage by playing d6, creating some pawn tension. If black doesn't do this, the game can be very unpleasant for them. For example, if black played something like e6, let's say c4, knight to b6, knight c3, I don't know, knight c6, f4, g6, knight f3, this is really bad for black. There's no pawn tension at all. White's space advantage is completely suffocating. White can play d5 at some point. Black can't play this way. That's why black almost always plays d6 here and starts trying to fight back against this space advantage. So this position is kind of considered the main starting point of the Alekhine Defense main line, and white has three options here. White can play knight to f3, simply developing a piece and adding more reinforcement here to the e5 pawn. White could play c4 and kick this knight away, and then simply exchange on d6. That would be the exchange variation. White maintains a space advantage there in the center. Or white's most ambitious line is to play c4, kick the knight away, and then play f4, and that would be the four pawns attack. So let's get started by looking at knight to f3. This is called the modern variation. White's in no rush to kick this knight away with c4. They know they can always do that later. And black has a couple popular moves here. g6 is one line, just fianchettoing this bishop and trying to add to the pressure here in the center. But bishop g4 is the most popular move here, just developing this bishop. White will usually play bishop to e2. And now black's most popular moves are e6 and c6. e6 makes a lot of sense from a development perspective. It kind of opens a line for this bishop to possibly take back here on d6 if white ever exchanges there. c6 doesn't really open any good developing lines. This is called the floor variation, but it has the point that if white ever plays h3, black might be able to exchange here on f3, and then black doesn't have to worry about white kicking this knight away and winning the b7 pawn, because this c pawn would be blunting this bishop here on f3. So it's kind of a preventative measure against that. e6 is a bit more popular though, so let's look at that option. Again, white could play c4 here and kick that knight away, but white most often just castles. This is very typical of how white plays in the modern variation. White's not too ambitious. They don't want to take the whole center. They're not really trying to, severely punish black for playing this opening and giving up a space advantage. They're just finishing their development, keeping their options open. They can always play c4 later. After bishop to e7, now white sometimes does play h3 and put the question to this bishop. Also, c4 is now very often played now that white has castled. After knight to b6, knight c3, we see that white's not worried about bishop takes f3, deflecting that bishop and winning the c4 pawn, because again, the b7 pawn is hanging because black did not play that move c6. We see that theme pop up again. And after knight to c3, black can castle, and white plays bishop e3, and white looks to have a pretty comfortable position here with this space advantage. Black does have some ways to try to fight against this. For example, black can sometimes play d5, sometimes in this position, sometimes later. But all in all, white has actually scored very well from this position, which is why some players with black have looked for alternatives, like that floor variation I mentioned earlier with c6. Coming back to this position after d6, we took a look at knight to f3. Now let's look at c4. The knight comes to b6, that's forced. And now let's say white takes on d6, this is the exchange variation. Black can actually take back both ways, they both kind of have their own advantage. Taking with the e-pawn opens up a spot for your bishop to develop, but taking with the c-pawn is taking towards the center, keeping your two central pawns here. So this is black's most popular option by a slight margin. Both moves are pretty popular. White can play knight to c3 here. And if black does take with the c-pawn, they almost always fianchetto this bishop. It doesn't make much sense to develop it to e7 or d6 if the pawns are there. So g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, and white often plays rook to c1 here. It's kind of a common plan in this line for white to develop the queen side before the king side. White knows that if they play knight to f3, black could probably just play bishop to g4 and pin this knight and add to the pressure of this d4 pawn. So white is avoiding this for now. If black wants to develop this bishop now, it probably has to come to f5, and it doesn't add as much pressure to the white center here if it's on f5. So in this position, rook c1, black usually castles. Black could play knight to c6, but it could be met by d5. But castles is the main move. And here again, white just plays this move b3, solidifying everything here on the queen side. It's almost a nice waiting move in a way, just reinforcing the c4 pawn, because now black's out of their automatic developing moves, and they kind of have to make a choice. If they want to play knight to c6, it's going to be hit with d5. If they play knight b to d7, now this bishop's blocked, and white can probably play knight to f3. If black develops the bishop to f5, now white probably plays knight to f3, and now this bishop isn't pinning that knight. Black would have to waste a tempo if they want to move it to g4 later. By the way, I said knight b to d7 blocks the bishop. Not only does it block the bishop, I think it also just loses because of c5. It takes away the only retreat square for this knight, and after these pawns are exchanged, that knight would be trapped. So there's one example of why you have to be careful when your opponent has a space advantage. Black's pieces here are kind of tripping over each other, fighting for the same squares. So in this position, black has a couple choices. Knight c6 is one popular option, but now white will play d5. And after knight to e5, not f4 right away, because then knight g4 is kind of annoying, attacking the bishop. Instead, white usually plays bishop e2, just developing a piece, taking the g4 square under control, and white can play f4 next turn and kick this knight away. And the main line continues f5, just adding more support here to g4, so that after f4 the knight can go here, and now white will exchange and finish up their development here with knight g to e2. And I've always found this position to be kind of pleasant for white. If black ever tries to strike at the center with e5 or something, you can take en passant. Black has this backwards d-pawn. To black's credit, black does have the bishop pair here against the bishop and knight, but I think that the downsides here of the black position don't fully make up for that. I kind of like this position for white. So knight c6 was one option. Black also sometimes plays e5 here, just striking back at the center right away. And this leads to an endgame. After d takes e5, black takes back, white exchanges here on d8, rook takes d8, and now c5. And we see that we end up with opposite side majorities. Black has this 4-on-3 majority here on the king side, which black could try to set in motion by playing f5 at some point, whereas white has a 3-on-2 pawn majority here on the queen side. Now black has to be careful. You can't play knight to d5 here because rook d1 is winning here for white because of this pin. After bishop e6, bishop c4, black is going to lose material. So instead, after c5 here, this knight has to come to d7. White usually plays bishop to c4, knight to c6, knight to f3. And white has some ideas in this endgame to play knight g5 at some point to really pressure f7. Sometimes white will play knight to b5, possibly coming to d6. So black has to be careful of some of these ideas. Black's most popular move here is knight to a5, trying to kick that bishop away. And even though the queens are off the board here, the game is certainly far from drawish. Both sides certainly are going to have their chances here to play for a win. So after b3 here, we've looked at knight c6, which gets hit with d5, and we've looked at e5, leading to this endgame. Black also sometimes plays f5 here, kind of a more ambitious option, possibly intending to play f4 soon. Certainly it's dangerous to expose the king like this and to play a move like this before you're really developed. Black only really has two pieces out, and instead of playing knight c6 or developing the bishop, they're already moving this f-pawn. But it's certainly an interesting attempt to mix things up, and enter some more original territory here with black. White has many options here, of course. One that I like is knight to h3. Kind of an interesting idea, just clamping down on the f4 square and developing that knight. Okay, so we've looked at knight to f3. We've looked at playing c4 and then exchanging on d6, the exchange variation. Now let's look at white's most ambitious attempt, the 4 pawns attack. White just reinforces this e5 pawn and really takes as much space as he can get. I believe this was world champion Alexander Alekhine's original conception here when he invented the Alekhine defense. You provoke white into kind of taking the full center, marching all their pawns forward, abandoning all the squares here behind these pawns, and black is going to try to tear this center down by playing maybe c5 later, and meanwhile black is going to have some active squares for the pieces to develop, as we will see. So let's look at how this can go. This can be pretty exciting. So d takes e5, f takes e5, knight to c6. Of course, white's not ready to start playing a move like d5 yet because the e-pawn would be hanging then. So instead, bishop to e3, bishop to f5, knight c3. Black can play e6, opening the line for this bishop to develop. We see that despite white's big space advantage, black is still managing to find a way to try to get their pieces into the game. White continues with their development as well. Knight to f3 is the most popular move here. Bishop to e7. Black has occasionally tried some other moves here too after knight to f3. Some players have even played bishop to g4, simply moving this bishop again to pin this knight, put some more pressure on the center here. We kind of talked about this in the exchange variation, how white delays playing knight f3 until the bishop commits to f5, but some players feel it's worth wasting this tempo and moving the bishop again. Also, of course, the bishop doesn't have to develop to e7. Black could develop it to b4. I think a lot of players don't want to give up the dark bishop, though, for this knight, because this bishop might be a very useful piece. If black ever tries to play c5 later and undermine the white center, black doesn't want to be left with a big weakness here on d6 that a knight could hop into. They want to retain that dark squared bishop. So just simply developing it to e7 and getting ready to castle is the most popular move. And white can certainly follow suit and just calmly develop here with bishop e2. That's one option. But the most popular move that's really in the spirit of the 4 pawns attack is playing d5. This e5 pawn's now defended. Black's not yet castled, so white thinks now is the best time to try to blow things open, make use of my space advantage, and start kicking these black pieces around. So, e takes d5, c takes d5, knight b4. Black's threatening to play knight c2 with a fork. Knight d4 is pretty much always played here. It's such a good multi-purpose move. It attacks the bishop, defends c2. Black can try to keep this bishop active with bishop g6, but now bishop b5 is going to be played, and this can be somewhat unpleasant here for black. So the most popular move is bishop back to d7. And now white pushes onward with e6, attacking that bishop again. F takes e6, d takes e6, bishop c6, and all the black pieces here actually stand very active here. Black has some very active pieces. This bishop has some open diagonals now, and really all white has to show for it is this e6 pawn that he's hoping will be a thorn in black's side, and the game can be very aggressive here. Queen g4 is the most popular move, immediately threatening the g7 pawn, and also preparing to castle queenside for white. For example, if black castles, now white will castle queenside, line up that rook with that queen, and again, a very double-edged game there. But black's most popular move here is not to castle. Black can throw in this move bishop h4 check. And white has to decide what to do here. If they block with the bishop, that doesn't look to be so great. Black can exchange, and this king's going to have to sit on f2. And if white plays g3, now this rook's undefended here. This bishop can take the rook, but nonetheless, this is the move white usually chooses, because after bishop takes h1, white can play castle long. So white's down a rook for now, but this bishop's under attack. There's discoveries threatened on the queen. If this bishop moves, this bishop is loose. g7's undefended. It's kind of hard for black to wriggle out of all of these threats, even being up a full rook. I'll just show one sample continuation. For example, after queen to f6, black gets out of the discoveries on the queen and possibly thinks about castling queenside. White can just take a piece back here on h4, and the game, of course, remains highly complex and tactical here. So if you want to go all out against the Alekhine defense and really get a big attack, this is probably the way to do it. Play the 4 pawns attack, wait for that bishop to commit to f5, and then you play knight f3 to defend your e-pawn, and then you play d5, shove that pawn in black's face before black can get castled, and this huge tactical skirmish will likely be the result. Alright, we've touched on all the main lines here of the Alekhine defense. Let's just talk about some sidelines to make sure you're aware of all the possibilities. So after e5, we said that black almost always plays knight to d5 here. Black certainly doesn't have to play knight to d5, though. Knight to g8 is one possible move. This is called the Brooklyn variation. It looks somewhat ridiculous, but even Magnus Carlsen has played this in a blitz game. So if it's good enough for Magnus to play, it can't be too terrible. Black's just kind of saying, okay, the knight's done its job here, it's provoked this pawn forward. Now black's going to try to tear down white's center and create some pawn tension here with d6. It should be noted that black's third choice here to play knight to e4, this is almost never played. This is extremely dangerous. This knight's almost trapped here. White has a couple ways to handle this. You could play d4, and this knight's really trapped. The knight has no safe squares to go to now. Black has some ways to try to wriggle out of this with like h6 so that you can play knight g5 and then knight h7, but that looks horrible, of course. Or white could even play d3 here, kick the knight first to c5, and now play d4 and kick it again. And after, for example, knight to e6, d5, you can kick the knight again. This is just really bad for black. You don't want to play this way. That's why knight to e4 is almost never played. Finally, after e5, knight to d5, we only discussed the line where white plays d4 and then black plays d6. We should talk about white's other alternatives here besides playing d4. White can play this move c4 here, which makes sense to kick this knight away. But this usually isn't its own independent line. This is just going to transpose to one of the lines we discussed. For example, after knight to b6, if white plays d4 and black plays d6, we're right back into some of our other lines here, where white can either exchange off and go to the exchange variation, or, of course, play the 4 pawns attack here with f4. So c4 usually doesn't have much independent value here. One other move white tries is bishop to c4, just not playing d4 and using this extra tempo to attack this knight. And there's some tricks black has to watch out for with the f7 pawn here. Black usually plays knight to b6, attacking this bishop. Bishop to b3. Again, black's got to watch out for this bishop on this very active diagonal, but if black knows what they're doing, this often won't be an issue. Black's most popular move here is to play c5, threatening to trap this bishop with c4. And this pawn also does a nice job of not letting white take the full center anymore, because if white plays d4 now, black could exchange that pawn off. White usually plays pawn to c3 here, giving this bishop an escape. And now after c4, bishop c2, you kind of enter this unique kind of position, definitely very different from a lot of the main lines of the Alekhine Defense. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something about the Alekhine Defense today. And if you haven't done so, please visit chesspathways.com right now. Just type it in your browser and get signed up. It's completely free, only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. I want to help more players become chess masters, and I'll make sure you never miss out on any new content. Thanks, and I'll see you there.